And all of my clocks agree and say that it is 1 minute after the hour. Friends and relations far and wide, welcome to our virtual conference. This is the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. I'm Mark Peterson, I'm the president, and I'm here to introduce our fabulous introducer for our fabulous first keynote speaker. For my part, let me say thank you so much to Arizona State University's Global Futures Laboratory for their generous support of this conference, for the Environmental Humanities Initiative and the Institute for Humanities Research for their sponsorship of our keynote lecture, and ASU's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for helping to make possible the ISSRNC's very first online, nearly carbon neutral conference. And for my part, friends, I'd like to turn this over now to Joni Adamson, who will be introducing Dr. Tiffany King. Thank you everybody again for coming and enjoy the conference. We will see you around the block.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm Joni Adamson, a professor of environmental humanities at ASU and director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative. And I want to thank everyone who has come today and also the ISSRNC Board of Directors for giving Arizona State University's Environmental Humanities Initiative the opportunity to co-host this conference. On behalf of ASU and as a member of the conference organizing committee, it's been my pleasure to welcome everyone to the conference today and to this session, which is also ASU's 2021 Environmental Humanities Distinguished Lecture with opening keynote Professor Tiffany King. We're pleased today that the audience that RSVP'd is over 400 people. So welcome from everywhere. We know we've got some people from Amsterdam and welcome everyone. We'd also like to begin by acknowledging the 22 Native nations that have inhabited the land on which we are meeting virtually and in person. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Acoma-Otom and the Peepash Indian communities. We acknowledge the sovereignty of these nations and advocate for the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges and research methodologies within contemporary academic and community knowledge practices. At ASU, we are proud of the breadth, depth, and excellence of our scholarship and research in the environmental humanities and of collaborations with our colleagues across the disciplines. Many of these collaborations are facilitated by the College of Global Futures, and we are very grateful that Peter Schlosser, Vice Provost of Global Futures and Director of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, so generously stepped up to make the College of Global Futures a sponsor of the ISSRNC conference. We're sincerely grateful to Provost Schlosser and to the college for their support. I also want to warmly thank my colleagues at the Institute for Humanities Research for co-sponsoring Dr. King's lecture. Ron Berlioz, Selena Osuna, Liz Grumbach, and Lauren Whitby have more than generously supported us by co-funding this lecture and helping us set up the webinar. We're really grateful to their careful attention to detail, and we also want to thank Joseph Carter of Live Streaming Success, who is running today's Zoom and YouTube sessions. The pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have called upon us to think more intently about the ways racism and structural inequities threaten both social and environmental health, and at the same time drive biodiversity loss and associated spillover events that make some communities more vulnerable than others to pandemic. The last year has only radically reinforced the continuing urgency of achieving racial and economic justice. For this reason, we're especially glad to be meeting this afternoon for Dr. Tiffany King's lecture, which is scheduled during Black History Month and which addresses the intersections between Black and Indigenous studies. Her topic is extremely fitting as an opening keynote for the conference examining relations and relationality. Dr. King joins a distinguished list of past EHI speakers, including Vandana Shiva, Amitav Ghosh, Mary Evelyn Tucker, Paolo Bacigalupi, Sir Jonathan Bate, and Elizabeth Hoover. We cannot thank her enough for coming to share her expertise and knowledge with us today. Professor King will be introduced this afternoon by J.T. Rowan, a professor of African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, and a 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Mellon Foundation Research Fellow at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at New York Public Library. Hi, JT. Dr. Rowan is also the director of the Black Ecologies Initiative at ASU, which is also co-sponsoring Professor King's lecture this afternoon. Finally, working with my colleague, Evan Berry, a professor of environmental humanities in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University, and a member of the conference organizing committee, has been the greatest of pleasures. I offer my warmest thanks to Evan and the ISSRNC Board of Directors for giving ASU the distinct honor of hosting this conference and keynote. Next, I'll turn the time over to our moderator, J.T. Rowan, who will introduce Professor King. After her lecture, we will facilitate a Q&A, which will be approximately 30 minutes and moderated by Professor Rowan. You may already have noticed that the chat is disabled in Zoom, but you may still ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom or comment directly on the YouTube chat. Both I and our EHI intern, McKenna Keller, will be collating your questions in both Zoom and YouTube, and we'll make sure they are passed along to Professor Rowan, who will present them to Professor King. Professor Rowan, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Joni. And it's really quite an honor to be in community with everyone who is joining us from everywhere. And I think especially I'm excited to introduce Dr. King today on what's Audre Lorde's birthday. Dr. King, it's really been a pleasure in the last couple of years to really get to know your work. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you. So just very quickly, Losing Faith in Works, Black and Indigenous Relations of Doing and Being. Our keynote speaker, Tiffany King. Dr. Tiffany King is an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Georgia State University. Her research is situated at the intersections of slavery and indigenous genocide in the Americas. Her book, which is fire, and you all need to go out and get it, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies on Duke Press 2019, argues that scholarly traditions within Black studies that examine indigenous genocide alongside slavery in the Americas have forged ethical and generative engagements with Native studies and Native thought that continue to reinvent the political imaginaries of abolition and decolonization. And Professor King's distinguished lecture with us this afternoon and this keynote emerges from forthcoming book project, her forthcoming book project, Red and Black Alchemies of Flesh, Conjuring, Decolonial, and Abolitionist Presence. So I really am so excited to be in conversation with you. Your work is really doing transformative field and path-breaking work that informs what we're doing with the Black Ecologies Initiative and just my work in general. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to you and look forward to your presentation, Dr. King. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, JT, for introducing me and for the invitation. I appreciate it, Evan, and also Joni and Mark and Joe for organizing this gathering. It's really, it's humbling and honoring to be able to deliver this opening keynote to this gathering of thinkers. I really look forward to attending virtually the 10 days of your deep dialogue and conversation with one another. It's a really important time to interrogate our deep investments in the things that anchor us and think about how those investments actually structure our relationships to one another and nature. So I'm glad that these days of gathering and conversation are happening. And the opportunity has actually given me the impetus to work on this new book project that JT mentioned, Red and Black Alchemies of Flesh. And I've actually have been allowed to spend some time putting some of the thoughts to the page. So I'm going to do some reading from that manuscript today. And Joe, I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay, so I'm going to start for you all. So, as humans in the midst of a pandemic, we are undergoing what the late speculative fiction writer and theologian Octavia Butler called a collective adaptation. So, for folks who don't know, many Black feminists, including myself, think about Butler as a theologian because of her parable series and the ways that she articulates through Lauren Olamina this theology of God as change, right? And so, as we are struggling to process mass death, our grief, and the technological shifts that unevenly make gatherings like these possible, many of us have also had to develop a new relationship to work. And for folks who find themselves unemployed or without stable work, and even those whose work is steady but altered, work has been interrupted. It is still certainly a deadly pursuit for people who are deemed both essential and devalued, who labor without protections in places where labor organizing has been violently suppressed. But for others who are afforded the latitude to work remotely from our home locations, work has perhaps become a little bit alienated in the sense that we're more alienated from one another and has created dis-ease for us as well. For many, the inability to work or work as we have been accustomed to it has created an existential crisis. And who are we if we cannot work? And this moment in which we are shifting our relationship to work has given me an opportunity to return to questions I only began to parse in the third chapter of my book, The Black Shoals. And specifically with the help of Caribbean scholar Shona Jackson and her work Creole Indigeneity, I had begun to think about the ontological underpinnings of work. And I began to ask questions like, to whom does work confer dignity? And whose work or who does work value, right? That particular category. And as I've been giving book talks and traveling and talking to multiple communities, I've had some great critical and generative feedback from Marxist scholars who wanted me to name my particular engagement with Marx's work. So which text was I launching a particular kind of critique as work as possibly a kind of liberal humanist category that actually does violence to the ecology. And so I thought, you know, in this next book project, I wanted to attend to Marx's earlier works a little bit more carefully. And so it's actually been a pleasure to return to some of Marx's work, particularly the economic and philosophical manuscripts, which I'm going to talk about in tandem with teaching Marx in the classroom. I have students in Atlanta, here in Muskogee Cree territory, who were engaged in the uprisings in the city of Atlanta after not just George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's deaths, but also after the murder of Rayshard Brooks here in the city. And so they're folks who are deeply engaged politically, developing an anti-capitalist critique. And I wanted to make sure that they not only knew about Marx's work on Twitter and Instagram, but had opportunities to read it. So going back to this category of work and Marx's work has been important to me. So in order to re-engage work, Marx, and on a movement off the shores of work, I'm going to tell some stories. Stories are important. Sylvia Wynter says that humans tell ourselves stories about who we are, and they often get treated as truths written in blood. However, human narratives as acts of poiesis are revisable. We can write new stories, ways of overcoming the ones that have damaged us. And there are two kinds of stories that I'm going to focus on today. There's one story told by Marx in 1844 of laboring man in the ideal sense as engaged in conscious, active, voluntary, and productive activity, which seems liberatory. However, I argue that this story of work in its most ideal form unintentionally reinstantiates ontological hierarchies. And this is not a particularly provocative statement. Scholars like Fromm in the 1960s and most recently Eckers and Loftus in their 2020 Antipode article have argued that Marx is in his most humanist mode in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. The second story is one retold by Leanne Betta Samasaki Simpson. The story, Banuchin Makes a Lovely Discovery, is a story from this hemisphere, which I argue frees us from the ontological grids that violently rank life. Stories, according to Leanne Simpson, are forms of theorizing. And I think of the late Barbara Christian when I read Simpson's explanation of stories as Nishnabeg intelligence and theoretical production. About stories, Simpson writes, a theory in its simplest form is an explanation of a phenomenon. And Anishinaabe stories in this way form a part of the theoretical basis of our intelligence. But theory also works a little differently within Anishinaabe thought. Theory is generated and regenerated through embodied practice and within each family, community, and generation of people. Theory is not just an intellectual pursuit. It is woven with kinetics, spiritual presence, and emotion. It is contextual and relational. This contextual and relational aspect of Anishinaabe thought is also an aspect of Indigenous queer feminists and eco-erotics and eco-sexualities. I think with queer feminist Indigenous eco-erotics as articulated by Kim Tallbear and Angela Wiley because they resonate with and pull Black queer erotic ecologies like L.H. Stallings' Geo Fuck It towards them. I will end this talk with the alchemy of braiding Indigenous eco-erotics and Black erotic ecologies to make a new Indigenous and Black story. So let's begin with story one. In the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx articulates an appreciation of the fact that, and I quote Marx here, man is a part of nature. For Marx, this was a common sense acknowledgement that man needed nature to survive. Marx articulated his understanding of the interconnectedness of man and nature as such. He says, man lives on nature, means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. That man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. Critical Marxists, eco-socialists, and feminists like Donna Haraway have paid close attention to and even praised Marx for this understanding of man's interdependency with nature. I too think it is important to attend to Marx's regard for nature and his view that man should not be separated from it. However, I tend to it as well for different reasons. I pay attention to Marx's regard for and regard of nature in the last section of the first manuscript entitled A Strange Labor in order to draw out some of its ontological underpinnings. In the last paragraphs of Marx's text, I see Marx undermining some of his own understandings of man as a part of nature. Marx makes statements about work as spontaneous, productive, and conscious activity that satisfies needs. In this section of the manuscript, Marx also enchants man with the capacity to create the world. This capacity is not given to animals, for it is the sole and unique capacity of man. According to Marx, man makes the world and his reality through his work on inorganic nature, things like plants, animals, stone, air, light. As a conscious species being, man produces freely and universally. Man is creative and productive in a way that creates aesthetic value. Man has the capacity to order time, space, and what is sensible and beautiful. I will read a passage from one of the later paragraphs in the section on A Strange Labor. I call it one of Marx's origin stories of man. In this passage, we observe Marx telling a story about man self-actualizing through his creative work. And during this process of self-actualization, man where he establishes himself as the creator and possessor of nature and thus the world and reality. Marx proclaims the following through this story. It is just in his work upon the objective world, therefore, that man really proves himself to be a species being. This production is his active species life. Through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life, for he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness intellectually, but also actively in reality, and therefore he sees himself in a world that he has created. In tearing away from man the object of his production, therefore, a strange labor tears from him his species life. His real objectivity as a member of the species and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body, nature, is taken from him. And one can read Marx's need to create a distinction or an advantage over animals in a number of ways. It could be a form of anxiety. I look forward to talking to more scholars that take Marx seriously to think about this move. Perhaps Marx needed to make a quick pivot away from his profound acknowledgement that man is a part of nature. And I'm not sure about the motivation, but it is a clear move to mark a boundary. And in the words of Donna Haraway, boundary making is always a political act. However, it is an extractive move that separates man from animals. And the Afro-Brazilian feminist scholar Denise Ferreira da Silva would call this a move to separability. For da Silva, separability as well as determinacy and sequentiality are pillars and organizing principles of Western reason and its violence, specifically its forms of racial violence. Further, Caribbean studies scholar Shona Jackson, who critiques the ontoepistemology in her fantastic book, Creole Indigeneity, argues that Marxist discourses of labor only offer affirmation of certain subjects. And I'm not engaging in criticism for criticism's sake here. Clearly, Marx's body of work is one of the most radical and revolutionary examples of European continental thought that calls for humans to change the world. However, I call attention to the production of an ontological grid in Marx's early work to disrupt a pattern. It's in these brief statements where Marx acknowledges an interchange with and a link to nature that Marxists, eco-socialists, and other critical Marxists find their alibi to continue to turn to Marx time and time again, rather than engage indigenous feminist thinking about land and traditions of Black feminist thought that attend to ecologies. To keep returning to Marx to make him an ecological thinker is to endlessly return to a form of humanism that produces hierarchies that degrade non-human animals, as well as in some contexts, Black and Indigenous people. I argue that Marx's acknowledgement of man's interchange with and link to nature is invested primarily in man's survival. Man or the human is the center of the universe who must tread lightly and in balance with the nature that he, to quote Marx, lives on as on top of. And I argue that Marx's configuration of man's relationship to nature and his articulations of ideal labor reproduce perhaps an ontology of a settler subject. Man is a steward of the land who needs the land as a substratum or substrate primarily for his own survival and ultimate dominion over it, even if the dominion is imagined as benevolent. Rather than return again and again to Marx to make this version of his work do something that it could not have done and cannot do for eco-socialists, I argue for a turn to Black and Indigenous feminist thinking on land and ecologies. Black and Indigenous feminisms expose a kind of humanism and degradation of animal life in Marx's 1844 manuscript that require our attention. And we need to turn to the work of Indigenous and Black feminists, particularly what they can tell us about the violent and humanist tendencies of work and labor, an activity that we actually deeply connect ourselves to if we are serious about being in right relationship with the earth, or what Leanne Simpson calls aki. So story 2. Leanne Simpson is a prolific Anishinaabe writer, artist, musician, and scholar who has written about land as pedagogy. Simpson writes that the land, Aki, is both context and process. In the book, as we have always done, Leanne Simpson tells or retells Anishinaabeg's story. Simpson retells the story of Banujan, which she has told many times, and almost each time that she retells it, it changes. The changing nature of it reflects the dynamic aesthetic capacity of Anishinaabeg's storytelling, as well as the ethics of making room for transformation as a story is retold. When I have witnessed Simpson retell it, Banujan, the human relative, is he, is she in another version, and is in later versions, non-binary. And in numerous public talks about this Anishinaabeg story, as well as in the book's section on aesthetics, Simpson talks about the function of repetition. Repetition is an element of the aesthetic world and world-making practice of Anishinaabe and many Indigenous nations. Repetition makes a story flexible, revisable, and more open to including marginalized voices over time. Much like Sylvia Wynter's notion of the human as revisable, Anishinaabe poesis, narrative, and world making is also evolving and revisable. In addition to the profound world-making potential of Anishinaabe storytelling is the way that this aesthetic practice reconfigures the Marxian humanist tale of work and humanity. If Marx's origin story of working man as species being is as separate from nature is the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscript, then Anishinaabe's stories about Banujan being open enough to receive sweet water, or what we know as maple syrup, is an origin story about the impossibility of human and nature as separate. Simpson begins her 2011 and 2017 retellings of the story with Banujan. In the 2017 retelling, Banujan has shifted from he to she to they. Simpson explains this as the queer and trans Indigenous potential of Anishinaabe storytelling. I want to engage my own queer, trans, and feminist version of this story through a Black, fleshy, and erotic telling. Simpson acknowledges that this story travels. Settler capitalists have told it to commodify maple syrup, but in my retelling, what is crucial is the reason and the mode of telling. What remains constant in Simpson's and my own retelling is that Banujan is out collecting firewood on this particularly lovely day. Nowhere in the story is this activity or this doing described as work or labor. And while I'm not arguing, nor is Simpson, that Anishinaabe people do not labor, there is no assignation of labor as an activity that is uniquely human or human producing. In 2020, during her Kreisel lecture, Simpson referred to the Anishinaabe as makers. And I want to stay with and interrogate this distinction over time because I think that it is critical. It may gesture toward the difference between collaborative and a relational activity with the earth and Marxian labor, even in its ideal register as an extractive process that removes the human from the realm of nature. As Banujan collects firewood for the later activity of making a fire, they rest under a tree. As they lay under the tree, they proclaim that they are feeling happy today. In their supine and perhaps prone position before that, which is a distinct counterposition orientation to the Marxian worker positioned over or upon the organic scene of work, Banujan is below and looking up to the tree, Ninatigag. And according to scholar Kemi Adeyemi, the supine position subverts or undoes the ideal human's angularity of 90 degrees that registers domination and uprightness over the earth. And I want to tarry with this supine position, this position of rest, of openness, reception, intimacy with, or embeddedness in the grass. It is a position of knowledge reception and production. It is opposite from the position of the worker working upon nature at a 90-degree angle or one greater than zero. Banujan's supine position of knowledge reception reminds me of the work and the ministry of Tricia Hersey. So for folks who don't know, Hersey is a womanist theologian a performance artist, and a community healer who's been called the bishop of the nap bishop, right? She preaches this gospel of napping. And Hersey says the following about the nap ministry, and I'm quoting Hersey here. We are deeply committed to dismantling white supremacy and capitalism by using rest as the foundation for this disruption. We believe rest is a spiritual practice, a racial justice issue, and a social justice issue. I began experimenting with these ideals as a way to connect with my ancestors, to receive a word from them, and to honor my body via rest for the rest they never were able to embody due to slavery and capitalism. This is about more than naps. And I've recently heard Hersey say on her IG Live that when she's napping, she's able to actually receive what she calls downloads from her ancestors. And a napping or supine position is an orientation of knowing or coming into knowing. Because Banujan is in a supine position, they can notice and acknowledge their relation from a position of openness rather than domination. They must look up, defer to, and submit, not necessarily to power, but to being open. It is also an erotic position of trust, comfort, and consent. And while the Banujan is lying down and looking up, they see Ajidamu in the tree. Bosu Ajidamu, I hope you had a good winter. I hope you had enough food cached. But Ajidamu doesn't look up because she's already busy. In Banujan's position under the tree and the squirrel, Ajidamu, they observe the squirrel engaged in activity. She, the squirrel, is engaged in a very specific activity. It is an activity that is related to time. Banujan is aware of Ajidamu's shared experience of winter. Banujan knows the challenges of winter for all their relations. They share a time space together and hope that their relative has fared well. They hope specifically that Ajidamu has had enough food. Ajidamu is busy as Banujan sends these well wishes. And I slowed down to pause with the time and pace and activity of Ajidamu in this story because it reveals a world-making capacity that is denied the animal in Marx's configuration of laboring man as the center of the world. Banujan is not the center of the world, time, nor does Banujan possess Ajidamu and the world that Ajidamu creates. They are worlds that coexist and at once worlds in one. In Ajidamu's world and time, she is not collecting nuts, Gowan. She's not building her nest, Gowan, not yet. She's not looking after any young, Gowan, it's too early. She's just nibbling on the bark and then doing some sucking. Ajidamu the squirrel has their own rhythm and time capacity. Gowan, it's too early for some things and not time for others. Nuts, home, children, and young are not the relations they attend to in this moment. They are nibbling bark and sucking in this moment. Unlike Marx's story of the unnamed animal, Ajidamu is not bound to life activity in any deterministic and overdetermined way. They are not merged with their activity. There are a range of activities, seasons, times, attentions, and decisions available to the squirrel. It is not the time for collecting nuts or building a nest or looking after young, which all have a specific temporality. It's too early for that. What Ajidamu is doing is the following: nibble, nibble, suck, nibble, nibble, suck. The nibbling and sucking that Ajidamu is doing is a repetitive act that aligns with the repetition of the story and the aesthetic force and capacity of repetition itself. The nibble, nibble, suck is an action or doing that grabs Banujan's attention. It moves and brings Banujan's attention to the deliberateness, the rhythm, the dense world making of Ajidamu. They are compelled and moved beyond their scope of knowing into another. Banujan is feeling a little curious, so they do that too on one of the low branches. Nibble, nibble, suck, nibble, nibble, suck, nibble, nibble, suck, nibble, nibble, suck. Banujan repeats the actions and doings of Ajidamu and also does more than merely mimic. In this moment of repeating Ajidamu's actions, they also subvert the human sensorium and its hierarchy of senses which is sight over smell. Benujan opens portals to knowledge through accessing an anti-colonial and non-humanist sensorium. From a prone or supine position, Benujan lays down rather than stands over to see Ajidamu. Rather than lead, Benujan follows and mimics a nibble nibble suck. They use taste, their tongue, and saliva to navigate and understand something new. A convergence of different senses creates this possibility for an awakening. Yoruba scholar Oyeronke Oyewume describes pre-colonial Yoruba epistemologies as anchored in a world sense, a system anchored in hearing or the sonoric with other senses like sight following. Sight does not become the privileged epistemology for knowing, nor does speech or language become the medium of exchange for understanding. Benujan must insert a branch into their mouth and rely on what the West deems as the baser sense, taste and sometimes smell, to learn that there is always a sweet sustenance in the form of sweet water in the tree. This stuff tastes good. It's real sweet water. Further, Benujan must take Ajidamu's, the animal's knowledge, time, and world seriously and be humble enough to learn from them. This scene of collecting firewood could easily be transmuted and mistranslated into a Marxian scene of human work if one were not careful. The humanist impulse to position oneself as outside, above, and in control of, or the author of nature, the squirrel, the tree, the world, does not exist in this particular story. Even the wood, prior to being turned into a different form of vitality, life-giving substance as fire, that wood has veins that carry sweet water. Benujan's story is not a revision to Marx's notion of labor. And what I mean is that it cannot be incorporated into, revise, correct, and leave Marxian notions of work as conscious life activity standing. It is also not a post-humanist tale in the Harawaiian sense. It is an Anishinaabe story of other kinds of worlds not figured into modernist and humanist cosmology of even the most radical continental thinkers. It is still an unthought by critical theorists and contemporary movements on the ground like Democratic Socialist of America or the DSA. It is a form of social and political thought that must be engaged to survive this pandemic, ongoing catastrophe, and what Octavia Butler has termed as our collective adaptation. This story of Benujan being compelled to nibble and suck on a branch also aligns beautifully with the recent work of African diasporan feminists and queer theorizings of erotic ecologies. In Jomaira Figueroa's book, Decolonizing Diasporas, she writes about the character Rebecca in Loida Maritza Perez's novel, Geographies of Home. Rebecca is an Afro-Dominican reeling from the multiple effects of destierro, what Figueroa theorizes as a violent ripping from the earth. Earlier in the novel, Perez paints an image of Rebecca as a teenager in the Dominican Republic before she is ripped from the land. Figueroa explains the erotic relationship that Afro-femmes and women have had to land. Figueroa writes, many of the women in the novel, especially those who are prepubescent or pregnant, express a craving to consume earth, dirt, and land. In fact, destierro is tied to women's bodies and the development of their erotic selves. In one scene, Rebecca recalls her teen years in the Dominican Republic when she would sneak out of the house to a quiet place and masturbate while chewing on grass. The movement of her hands massaging the tender flesh between her thighs, the bitter taste of a blade of grass tucked between her teeth. This appetite or craving for the land is called pica within this Afro-Latinx femme universe. Found in several places across the African diaspora, this hunger and hankering for a taste of land is named a number of different things. In a Dirty South manifesto, L.H. Stallings argues that this eating of dirt, nibbling and sucking of blades of grass or tree branches by Black, Indigenous, and poor queer whites is pathologized by Western medicine. It is called geophagia. Of dirt eating and geophagia, which Stallings renames geophucket in the book, Stallings relays the following. Eating dirt is an embodied practice that existed before medical boards and cartography and the treatments and treaties constructed out of them. Yet compelled by the land's refusal to be metaphysically alienated from flesh, these dirt eaters pass on knowledge and minerals about an older system so that their descendants may know something more about the world than what dated treaties, proclamations, and certified disorders can tell them. Though economically empowered white communities arduously invent religions or national identities out of opposing dirt, as well as create industry out of possessing it, when Black and Indigenous people or poor queer whites insist with effortless sensorial action upon the value, worth, and natural connection of dirt to living beings, it becomes geophagia, an illness or crisis to be healed or overcome. Nevertheless, what dirt tastes like or the sensation that it evokes, gustatory perception and pleasure, is not what settler colonialism has alluded to in its articulation of geophagia as a mental disorder. I link Simpson to the Afro and Black erotics of Figueroa and Stallings through the act of nibbling, sucking, eating, and swallowing. That also connects the sweet water to Ajidamu and Ajidamu to Banusian. More than the animal and the human consuming earth, according to Stallings, an appetite for the earth is caused by land's refusal to be separated from flesh. The land has given us, human and non-human animals, this appetite and erotic desire for it. The land has decided that it wants to be with us. This orientation, this attention to the vitality of animals, land, sweet water is one that exceeds human stewardship. And here I think with the amazing scholar, J.T. Rohn, and specifically Rohn's work in plotting the Black Commons, that makes a distinction between the practice of plotting in the Black Commons from that of mainstream environmentalism. For Rohn, mainstream environmentalism maintains what Rohn calls the man-subject, earth-object relations of mastery implied even in saving this or that species or ecosystem. In contrast, Rohn's articulation of the Black Commons in its practices of the outdoors and ecstatic community retains subject-to-subject relations. Banusian and Black people's nibbling, sucking, and dirt eating reflects the subject-to-subject relations I think Rohn is speaking of. As a way of concluding, I position Simpson's Banusian Makes a Lovely Discovery as an extension of Simpson's notion of Anishinaabe anti-capitalism. Simpson's anti-capitalism, as well as other Indigenous anti-capitalisms, are essential readings. Social movements will not succeed without them. Of Anishinaabe anti-capitalism, Simpson says this: I think it is important that we continue the work of our ancestors and our elders in critiquing and analyzing capitalism, how it drives dispossession and its impacts on us from our own perspectives. Indigenous peoples, in my mind, have more expertise in anti-capitalism and how that system works than any other group of people on the planet. We have thousands and thousands of years of experience building and living in societies outside of global capitalism. We have seen its apocalyptic devastation on our lands and plant and animal relations. This in no way diminishes the contributions of other anti-capitalist theorists, thinkers, and writers. Rather, I think it adds the beginnings of a critical reframing of the critique, one that is centered within grounded normativity. For even radical and critical Marxists, work in its pure conscious and life-generating form is a gospel that has a true hold. The underside of this desire for Western human creativity links one to a desire for self-possession and possession of the world and reality that has to be exercised. We are learning and adjusting in unimaginable ways right now. The pandemic has forced some of us out of the category of worker and caused a deep, deep crisis. This crisis of identity might be a way out. So many other modes of organizing, as well as positions and experiences outside of work, exist, as we have learned from disability justice activists who are trying to build more expansive practices of building collective or people power. These movements have so much to tell us. As we embrace the flux and move with the shifts of our collective adaptation, the prophetic words of Octavia Butler's character, Lauren Olamina of the Parable series, still ring true. God is change, and we are more than our work. Thank you so much for your attention and the invitation to deliver this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. There you have me reeling, just in terms of these kinds of connections that you're building around Black and Indigenous intimacies and possibilities, taste in the earth, and other formulations that go outside of the category of work. And I think, as you highlighted, it's so essential, especially right now, given the kind of ways that crisis has opened the road for us, right? We can we can go to more of the enduring and unchanging same, or we can really radically reimagine our relationships with each other, and through that with the earth. I really, really appreciated your remarks and have so much to think about. I think we're starting to get some questions in, and so I don't even want to hold you with, because if I start asking you questions, we'll talk the whole time, because there's so much there. So there was one of the questions that has come up is just about the ways that you employed these wonderful sources and how you engage across Black and Indigenous writing. Could you just say a bit more about how you come to find these kinds of complex relations, both in the first book and then in this project?
Yeah, that's a thing, right? I tell this story about how I not stumbled upon, I guess, drove upon the show, right? Like these moments where some of your, I guess, proprioception and motor skills and less muscular kind of activity around creativity and thinking kind of takes hold. So when I was driving along Flat Shoals, I looked up and saw shoal when I was struggling to find something that wasn't the shoreline or a space that could be incorporated to think about this meeting space of water and land. So that kind of, I got to give it over to some other kind of creative energy, like much like Hersey is talking about, like the hours before I'm falling asleep, like the times when I'm texting ideas and drawing and scribbling notes allows me to make new connections between texts that I've been thinking with for a while. So I've been thinking with Leanne Simpson's work for several years. And then along with having conversations with the Marxist scholars that I respect, who are like, draw us in by helping us think about which texts in Marx you're thinking about, like having that conversation and then thinking with Leanne Simpson and all that I had read, I'm like, oh, this is a great scene to start to think about origin stories about man and animals and making and work and doing, right? So that over time, relationships and reading practices with different bodies of work kind of come to me, sometimes in these down spaces, like washing dishes and doing other things. So I'm sure people have their own kinds of practice of how rubbing disparate texts or reading disparate texts have these magical moments when you're not trying to force something where, oh, I see an opening, right? There's a scene here that folks might think is labor, a collection of firewood, that I can think about with a scene from Marx's 1844 text that are doing some different things, but could they be in conversation? I think that's also a part of a legacy of my training as an Americanist, right? And particularly American Studies at Maryland, we were taught to not to be afraid of the experimental and the creative, of rubbing things together that don't seem to make sense. So it's a little bit of like the discipline of that training, but also like what happens in those down, restful, not necessarily idle times that I think Trisha Harris is talking about. Like she was literally talking about receiving downloads from the ancestors, right? Like what's happening in the non-work mode, right? What kind of creative stuff is coming up? So it's a combination of that. I hope that was helpful for that person who answered that question, because I rambled, but experimentation, time with the text, right?
And that kind of openness and playfulness, I vibe in the way that you talking through your method really vibes with other modes outside of work in general. So I think that's, I love the way that you phrased it in terms of downtime, if not necessarily a kind of, downtime, right? And thinking about how we maneuver within that and what kinds of worlds are created in that, in those moments at those edges of like what's so centered in our society. We have a question, so I'm just going to read it. Thank you for enlightening and remembering Karl Marx's German continental idealism on nature surrounding humans. Is it reasonable to believe that Marxism could support or reestablish human nature interrelations after experiences known from European East Bloc countries overexploiting nature sources for decades? And this person is asking from the perspective of having served in the National Park Authority during the communist regime in former Yugoslavia. So I guess part of it is, I guess where does Marx and Marxism, I guess given the kind of histories of the ways that Marxist thought materialized in certain kinds of states and regimes, how do we negotiate between those kinds of realities and what you're calling for in relation to turn into Black and Indigenous communities to rethink overexploitation or to rethink our connections?
Yeah, I think that as Marx's work and his theoretical gifts travel, they have to be transformed, right? I think that when you take up Marx in this context and this hemisphere, you have to read it with the anti-capitalisms of Indigenous people and Black folks, right? So in my own classroom, when I'm teaching Marx, I'm also teaching Cedric Robinson's work, Leanne Simpson's work, right? There's just not, it's impossible to make Marx's work do what an eco-socialist would want it to do, not in relationship with Indigenous and Black thinking on anti-capitalism. So it's not a discarding or a displacement of Marx, right? I mean, the person who said this really eloquently for me, and it really resonated with me, was Saidiya Hartman in conversation with Arthur Jafa about Wayward Lives, where she was talking about this anarchic kind of Black girl tradition that was kindred to, or the tradition of socialism was kindred to that tradition, right? So Marx's tradition, certainly socialism and communists, that work is kindred to Black abolition, Indigenous sovereignty, right? And certainly if you look at the ways that, for instance, the Red Nation has taken up Marx's work, right? There's a deep engagement with it, but it gets transformed in the process of landing on the ground where Indigenous people's land is, right? And for an eco-socialist to do respectful and important radical ecological work, they have to do that in the context of land back, Indigenous sovereignty, reparations, and Black abolition. And so therefore, what your particular Marxist theory is going to look like has to be transformed over time, right? So that's what I'm arguing, right? You can't continue just to return to Marx, particularly not in this context and on this geography, right? So how is your Marxism changing? And so I'm trying to, in another project, also look at how the DSA, for instance, still doesn't have an Indigenous working group, which might be because of the radical kind of antagonism of their brand of Marxism is not dealing with settler colonialism, right? And also haven't leaned into a red New Deal, right? They have a Green New Deal, but do very little to engage the issue of land back or idle no more, right? And so again, you have to engage Indigenous movements and Indigenous thinking, right? For your Marxism to really mean anything and do anything.
Right. I wanted to follow up with that with my own sort of musing and question. I've been, the Green New Deal is kind of on the table, right, as a kind of formulation. And as you begin to highlight in your last comment, it doesn't necessarily dispense with visions for growth or the dependence on labor in a certain formulation. It in fact invokes all of those to justify itself. I wonder if you could, perhaps offer what I guess a Black and red New Deal might look like as opposed to a Green New Deal. Not necessarily in terms of, policy laid out, but what would the Green New Deal look like or materialize like if it really centered Black and Indigenous claims around land and environment?
I just whistled. So I'm like, wow, that's a whole meeting series, yeah, of conversations, conferences. That's deep. Like, so what would that look like, right? To take up certainly land back, Indigenous sovereignty, how folks affiliated with Movement for Black Lives are thinking about reparations, right? So are thinking about beyond a simple class critique and redistribution, right? Thinking about some ways of being with the earth that have yet to be acknowledged, that we have not even made space for, right? And to think, when you also said, like how we reimagine that Green New Deal, bringing in Indigenous sovereignty, Black abolition, Black liberation. I also want to think with disability justice, because those folks really press on the category of work as a space where people gain dignity. So there is a way that that movement is trying to make ever expansive the kinds of folks who do political work and have political imaginaries that we don't even think of, because they won't necessarily be on the shop floor or be imagined as workers, right? With particular politics around redistribution and relations of production, right? So thinking with Black folks, Indigenous folks at the intersections of disability could really reorient how we imagine our activity, our daily activity, our relationship to the earth, unthingifying things, right? So I think that Indigenous studies, Black studies gets us out of the mode of unthingifying things, right? And helps us think about subjects who weren't imagined as a part of the proletariat in some of those early configurations of Marx, right? What are their political imaginaries that we have not considered? And what is that going to do, particularly their relationships to ecologies, going to do how we even imagine, how we negotiate, how we share space here, right? So I know dealing with the landscape in Georgia around gentrification is a really deep thing that white liberals and progressive folks have to deal with, right? It often drops off the table because I've argued it's very easy. I was thinking about the Rayshard Brooks instance to burn down a Wendy's in a poor Black neighborhood, but not burn down the Beltline, a gentrifying force in Atlanta. There may have been some attempts to loot there, but neighborhoods that are white and gentrified don't get burned down during our uprisings, right? There's a sense of that kind of white property cannot be touched, right? So again, white people's deep possession in their own kind of white property and white spaces don't necessarily come under critique or don't become part of the project, the radical project of Marx and Engels to destroy all of bourgeois culture, right? What are we going after during our uprisings, right? What are we willing to level and create ground for something else to grow? And I think if you took a nod from Black folks, Indigenous folks, and disability justice people, we will be remapping space in our ecologies in incredible ways, JT. I want to continue to talk with you about it because, yeah. That's a deep question. That's such a deep question.
I really appreciate your really thoughtful engagement with it, because I know that that's like you said, that could be several conversations. Someone wanted to ask about your discussion of geophagia and epistemology of the baser senses of taste and smell. This questioner seems to be such an important reclamation of a fuller understanding of embodied life and an important connection and resonance with others other than human. This observation is also so timely in the context of the COVID pandemic, when people are losing their sense of taste and smell. Could you reflect more on the incorporation of these senses into epistemologies, and how to understand the insights from these non-verbal, non-visual senses?
I got to give all due to LaBonda H. Stallings, right? I mean, that book, Funk the Erotic, took me out, where she like really delves into the way like Western epistemologies and cosmologies have really kind of degraded that sense of smell, right? So leans into the funk and has us reorient our sensorium to think about what we reject in ourselves and what we reject in other people. So that is like some of the calls that like LaMonda Stallings are making, also Oyeronke Oyewume's work in The Invention of Women that I continue to teach. This radical undoing of Western thinking and being at the level of senses is literally like the deep work that we have to do right now, right? Like really remaking the self and what you think you desire and want. That's on the table. And like this person is saying, we've had the opportunity to do that in a shutdown in some senses, and to do that in spaces of illness. I don't know how to answer that question around what people do when they've lost a sense of taste and smell. Maybe it's thinking with that person over time to see what other kinds of senses they started to notice, right? We certainly have more than 9 senses that we don't pay attention to, but what other kinds of things do we have to lean into when we can't rely on one sense? And LaMonda Stallings and Oyeronke Oyewume are offering that to us in a more kind of voluntary context to pay attention to what our normative modes of navigating the world don't make available for us, right? And to think seriously, again, this is why thinking with that first question about Indigenous epistemologies, what that could make possible for you and for all of us, right? So from the level of epistemology, ontology to the self, that work of refashioning ourselves, like that's a mode that I think many of us are deeply kind of tapped into right now, particularly folks who are living alone, have to deal with themselves, and also living with other people, right? How do I contend with myself on really different terms? So we hopefully can make it through this and create something else, right?
Yeah, thank you so much. And L.A. Stallings is the truth. Funk there, everything Stallings right is just it. Um, I want to move to this question. How would you envision this coalition of Black and Indigenous erotic thought in relation to death? Specifically, Western ideas of extracting oneself from the earth through working to create and continue burial processes that maintain that separation from nature. For example, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been historically shoved back into the realm of dirt and the earth via unmarked graves or some other kind of formulation. So how would we reclaim that eco-erotic space of being with the earth?
I feel like asking this person, do they mind if you talk? Because I just read about the plot in your work. Read J.T. Rome's work, Plotting the Black Commons, because that does work around that, right? These cultures of memoriam, I don't even speaking to it, right? Cultures of death and thinking with attending to our dead. I think there's some shared practices and vibrations between Black and Indigenous communities and Black Indigenous people, right? We tend to bracket off Indigenous from Black, but certainly there's Black indigeneity that people are bringing through that Middle Passage journey to this space that have resonances with rituals and mourning that Indigenous people do here. I don't, JT, you have some thoughts?
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think in the original context for me of thinking, building out of winter as well, I think plotting and the plot, part of the ways that Black communities partially indigenized and created decolonial relations to the earth was through literally through the kind of cultural reproduction around death and mourning and dying that brought them in direct connection to the ground, and also became a source of loss beyond just those who are living. When people are sold, for example, in the antebellum period, you know, you have to leave. And not only are you leaving your living loved ones, you're leaving those who are in the ground in that space, your loved ones. And so I think that following winter, a lot of those kinds of relations really help us to, or a way to, a rubric out of which to think about some of very similar like intra-communal, intra-human relations that refigure our bases of community, right? That center death, but that are not totally conscriptable to death. And I think the funeral, I mean, when you look at 20th century Black social scientists who are, many of them are lamenting Black migrant cultures, you know, one of the things that they lament, for example, in New Orleans and Chicago, is the ongoing use in storefronts of like showing the body to everybody in the congregation. But I think those kinds of rituals are the way, and all of that are the ways that Black communities create and distill the plot and plotting into mobile cultural resources that create a cultural milieu that allows for an ongoing criticism and critique and engagement with questions of work and those kinds of things. So I really appreciate the idea that you read something that I wrote. Really, I'm over here like, oh my God, thanks. So I appreciate you. But I think it does. You know, I think it does. There's so much to be done about these kinds of spaces that emphasize other temporal, spatial, relational modes. And so I think death and dying are central sites of Black cultural reproduction. I'm not sure if that answered the person's question either, but I appreciate you engaging it. I want to switch to another question. Someone says, thank you for bringing up gentrification. What might we think through gentrification in Atlanta and other Black majority cities alongside removal of Creek and Cherokee people in the South? What is the potential for allyship between Native and Black people around urban gentrification in spaces that are already colonial?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that question. That takes me back to an experience I had in 2016 with Red Bike and Green, which is a group of Black folks and some people of color allies who are affiliated with a number of groups in the city, like folks from Southerners on New Ground, Sister Song, Snapco. Those folks get down and bike as a way of taking up space, right? As a way of, and Atlanta is probably about to not be a Black majority city no more. It might even be 50-50 at this point. But because of the ways that gentrification are moving Black folks around and have us jostling, like the explicit use of the bicycle to take up space, to cut through grocery store parking lots, frustrate consumers, I just think is dope. And one of the rides that I went on, it was a part of one of their dialogical bike tours where they were remapping the city and telling like a people's or oppositional kind of geographic story about the city. So one of the stops was at the MLK MARTA station, and there they started off by acknowledging this is the ancestral territory of Muskogee Creek folks who should be allowed to return, as well as the land where many of our ancestors were enslaved and tortured to make this MARTA line, right? So these kinds of acts of reclaiming space on Indigenous, specifically Muskogee Creek and Black terms, is just an important kind of framing for the kinds of spatial work they were doing on bikes, right? And so these are also the organizers who are part of these organizations that are pressing on some of the like corny politics of some of the white liberals who go out in gentrified neighborhoods, all white groups with Black Lives Matter signs up at Boulevard and Memorial, who live in these gentrified communities, who are pushing out Black communities, right? So having Black organizers press on very well-meaning white liberals to be like, this is not about a sign. And if Black Lives Matter, you would really think about your consumption practices, flipping houses, owning multiple houses, the kinds of upgrades that you make, right? The kinds of restrictive covenants, the kinds of private police organizations and private police that you hire to actually police your neighborhoods is a part of the problem, is a part of the dehumanization of Black life, which also makes it impossible for Muskogee people to return. I'm thinking about when this person was asking about projects, like a really deep ethical project that Trevor Ellison is working on is, it's, what's the name of the retreat space, JT? Decahedron, I think, where they're using their, the space that their grandparents gave to their parents and parents, I guess, Trevor's father gave to them after they passed away, and is making that into a land for Black and Indigenous people, Black and Indigenous, Black, trans and queer people, and a space of return for Muskogee people, right? To be in that space, particularly movement folks who are working on abolition and land back. So those are some of the projects that are resisting these uneven geographies and these violent historical forms of displacement.
Thank you for that. This is a bit of a broader question, but I think, you've started to answer this all throughout. But to what degree are anti-racism and anti-capitalism intertwined historically and theoretically and in the contemporary socio-culturally? How might we envision post-capitalist and optimistically post-racial racist systems, either locally or globally? And I think, again, in some ways, this returns us to, the kind of question that was hinted at in how do we think a Green New Deal? What are the ways forward, I guess, is part of the question. Are there ways to use anti-racism from a Black and Indigenous perspective to create systems that are functional beyond, that are functional at community levels at different scales?
My impulse is really, for that question for myself, is not to operate in the abstract anymore. Like I have been called in a deep way to skill up and get involved in movement work. So I feel like those answers specifically at a local level are things that are going to come from that context, and particularly thinking about the kinds of experiments that folks at the Highlander Center, folks doing work around the Black Land Project, like the kinds of conversations that they're having with Indigenous folks. And then in some instances, bringing white allies into that conversation to have conversations about the redistribution of resources in a really explicit way on how they can redistribute their resources in the form of land and capital to some of that work on the ground. So I would think that where you are connecting with those communities is going to kind of be the way forward in developing a politic and an imaginary and a theory around that. So it's like being deeply rooted and reading the work of Black ecological thinkers, like doing Black ecologies, because one thing I love about your work, JT, and the work that folks in Black ecologies are doing, and Black geographies, Catherine McKittrick, right, is just being really, really specific. I remember, some of McKittrick's kind of intervention to say that metaphors are fine, but we have to make this really grounded. And I think like this question begs for a kind of groundedness of you being on the ground with people doing this work, working together, learning from each other, building relationships, figuring out what doesn't work, and figuring out what you have to do and where you have to contribute. So I don't feel comfortable asking that in the abstract, but for intellectuals and scholars who are here, like reading some of the stuff that folks, certainly Indigenous thinkers and folks working on Black ecologies are thinking about at the level of like community mobilization, organizations, and individuals doing the ground, because we have a great tradition of name dropping those people and that work in our own scholarship.
I wondered if you could comment just a bit more on, the kind of, I think there's a question that's similar to this, but it's still resident with me where I'm at. So since I'm moderating, I'll take the liberty of asking my own question. I just wanted you to, in some ways it's very self-serving. I'm really thinking about, I think at length in the plotting essay about feasting, but I also in the wider project think about feasting in the context of certain Black religious traditions, like the Peace Mission and Father Divine in them. There's so much work that happens when people eat together. Could you comment more just about these kinds of shared, the world making practices that come through the other senses, that are not about, that aren't about kind of registering visual hierarchy or this body belongs in that place, or those kinds, like the ways that the visual, and then also, of course, the other senses in the sensorium being marshaled to heighten the sight, right? Something, how smell and taste and other and haptics and all of that are brought in to confirm visual hierarchies that are already established. So, but these other route, and again, you invoke Stallings. I just want to have more of that conversation is all I'm saying. How can we theorize and think about community formations and reformulations through the non-visual, through other registers of possibility for connection?
Yeah, it's beautiful that you started with the feast and then took us to spirituality, right? Father Divine, because I have been reading for prep. Well, I'll do a plug of your book since it's right here, but Alicia Lola Jones is flaming and thinking about Black voice, masculine performances of being a vessel to set an atmosphere. So thinking about feasting and prayer, right? Which is a Black tradition, which is an Indigenous practice as well, because I was recently having a talk with Holiday Simmons, who's Afro-Cherokee, who wants to host a session with Amber Starks, Melon, and Muskogee that is about one, healing between Black and Indigenous communities, actually having a context for us to apologize to one another for the ways capitalism and conquest have forced us to betray each other, but to do it through sharing prayers, right? So having prayers humming, singing, rising through your body, right? The way that changes you on a molecular level, on a vibratory level, right? Humming, even if it isn't an uttering of a word, like speaking in tongues, right? Things like that, that aren't always intelligible or legible, right? Within grammar or language, right? Within speech, but also the humming and the vibration prior to opening yourself up to ingest something and share food. And I'm thinking I just heard a presentation by my colleague Elizabeth West on how the act of preparing and sharing your food, the washing of hands, like rituals like that, and the transference of energy through food and ingesting are some of the senses where we can do a deep kind of work with one another, right? And that brings smell, taste, the tongue, saliva, the sharing of breath, thinking with the Sean Crowley, like into the space. So we can lean into that, right? And not be oriented by the kind of domineering senses that we have been flexing, right? And building up our muscles around. So I think that space of a feast opens up so much because it brings up so many kinds of practices, Black and Indigenous practices, that go beyond simply eating and digesting, right? But being on a shared hum and a different rhythm. That's a different kind of activity. It's also not work, right? Necessarily. Mm-hmm. So I like that, thinking with the senses to thinking about communes, the commons community. What other kinds of commons can we build through different senses is a wonderful opening, JT. It was a wonderful opening.
Thank you. I think we're nearly out of time, but I'm going to ask one more question. So this person writes, I was struck in the talk by the ways that disability haunts these origin stories of human inseparability from ecology, the position of the body at 90 degrees, the pathologization of ecoerotics, the hierarchy of the senses. I wonder if there are ways that you are thinking about disability justice as a prism for thinking through the ecological, as well as engaging its commitment to anti-capitalism and the refusal of work productivity as redemptive or as a path to re-enfranchisement in the human.
Whoever that is, I want to do all the things that you just said. I haven't done the work in disability studies that I need to, but I'm certainly reading Pepesna Samarasina's work and Moya Bailey's work, Terry Pickens' work, Izetta Autumn Mosley's work, and have to build up my bibliography for Indigenous and disability studies, that nexus, that particular intersection. But that's a vision, that's a horizon for that that last question. I appreciate the question because that's what's pressing on me, like the critical ways that disability justice really interrogates that category of being a productive subject is critical right now, and the ways that they have shaped the mutual aid work that's going on literally today in Houston is something that needs to be attended to, right? And we need to pay attention to. And also, who is exerting themselves and building relationships in a way that can radically reorient ourselves to one another is really, really important. And also the language in disability justice circles is helping me also exercise my own poetic repertoire to start to think outside of work and labor when I'm talking about activity. So also stretching my own grammar is something that's disability justice movements, particularly movement spaces, are going to help me do. So I appreciate the question and want to move there, actually. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, this is just a very quick comment. The book hasn't yet dropped, but I've read the intro online of Kevin Kwashi's work on Black Aliveness. So I think, maybe we'll have something there as well in terms of actions that aren't building our vocabularies and actions that aren't necessarily about work, but that are about aliveness and these kinds of rubrics. I want to thank you so much, Tiffany King.
Thank you, JT.
An amazing.
We can do it again.
We do, we really do. I think part of getting around work is also this kind of one-off culture. Like maybe there is space and time for us to have returns and more sustained conversations. But I really, really want to thank you for such a beautiful conversation and such a beautiful lecture. And I look forward to this book as much as I look forward to rereading again in the classroom, Black Shoals. So thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you.
And I'll just quickly wrap this up by saying thank you so much, Professor King, for this wonderful, provocative, deeply thoughtful lecture, and JT for your excellent moderation. We really appreciate that. This was an excellent launch event for the conference, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you with your amazing questions at during different sessions throughout the week. So thanks for coming, everyone. We really appreciate this. And thank you so much for your distinguished lecture, Dr. King. Bye, everyone.